All right, we're about 3 minutes away. I see we have a few attendees already in line. We have a good core of our ATC members on with us, but we're going to wait a few more minutes, a couple more minutes now. And then I'll give a little rundown of some of the basics and then hand it over to Bob to facilitate. I will say I find it quite interesting that how time has changed. It used to be that you know, a 5:30 meeting would maybe get started at 5:35 or so. And, you know, your meeting sort of ran early or late, and there's a lot more flex. But now it's amazing how you start a meeting at 5:30 and it's 5:30. If someone is a minute or two late, it seems like very late in this Zoom world. Okay. All right. So we are just about a minute away from officially starting the ATC meeting. Let's see, I'm going to start my recording again here. Lee, one question for you. It looks like we have folks coming on still. I just want to make sure that we have the right quorum if we do have any voting pieces. So if you can just kind of keep an eye on how many ATC members we have. If we seem like we're short, I just want to make sure that we're at quorum for any voting pieces. Oh, I put you on mute. What was that, Lee?
We have 7. We need 7.
Okay. We just need one more for quorum. All right, it's 5:30. And there we have, oh, Chelsea's joining us, great. So we'll wait for a couple more panelists, ATC members to join us. I'm Shane Rhodes. Thanks for those joining us for our ATC Active Transportation Committee meeting, monthly meeting. We have a few ATC members on. Okay, we're getting higher numbers, good. And then we do have a few attendees, and we have some who've raised their hands already. So I just want to let people know, if you would like to speak in the public comment period, you can raise your hand as an attendee. Also, if you would like to do some Q&A, you can put those in the Q&A box as well. And I will try and facilitate those conversations with ATC. I'm going to be handing the meeting over to Bob to guide us through the agenda, and I will be here as support. And then we have Lee Shoemaker, another city staff person, to take notes and offer any support as well. And then see that we have another city staff person, Chelsea Clinton, who's with us, and she is on the agenda for one of the pieces. So Chelsea, you can go ahead and I can either, you can keep your camera off, or I can also move you into attendees and bring you back in. Just send me a message if you'd like any of those. Want to remind everyone, attendees, if you do speak, that we ask that you keep it to 3 minutes or under. ATC members, sort of depending on how time goes, might want to ask a question or two of you, and that's fine. Once you're done speaking, I'll bring you on as a panelist, and then I'll put you back in as an attendee after you're done speaking. And again, raise your hand or put Q&As in if if you have any questions. And Bob, I'll, and just also a reminder to that this is a meeting that is being broadcast live and also on YouTube. It will be recorded, so it can be a reference for you. And also a reminder to keep things civil and keep discussions open and safe for everyone. Bob, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shane. Well, the first thing on the agenda is public comment. So Shane, if you're able to coordinate the public comment, we will start that now.
Yep, so far I have Webb and then Sue. And so I will bring, looks like I can allow Webb to come on there. There you go, Webb.
Thank you, Shane. My name is Webb Sussman, and I live in West Eugene. And I've been involved in transportation and bicycle issues for probably the last 40 years, on and off. I'm coming to you tonight not around bicycle issues, but around pedestrian issues. We have a severe problem in many areas of the city where we have gaps in the sidewalk system that are not getting corrected and probably won't get corrected without action. These gaps are a safety issue. They're an issue for children going to schools. They're an issue for the elderly and physically infirm who are trying to move around the city, who may or may not own an automobile. And I, for one, happened to, well, it wasn't a direct cause of it, but I was involved in a car on pedestrian incident about 6 years ago now, where I was struck by an automobile while crossing a street. The street I was coming onto and the street I was coming off of did not have sidewalks. And I had to be walking in the street. And that was, according to EPD, approximate cause of my injuries. Needless to say, I'm not happy about this. I do, however, have a proposed solution. Well, suggested solution. One, the city could consider, as part of the city's road bond issue, apportioning a percentage of that money toward incorporating sidewalk repair, replacement, and creation for city road bond projects. So that if a project was going to occur in an area, the city's done extensive surveying of missing sidewalks. The city could target in that construction area those missing sidewalks and create them. That's one option. Another option would be something similar to the road bond issue, but for bike and pedestrian projects, which would block out a certain chunk of the city per cycle and do a comprehensive survey of missing facilities in that area and use that funding to provide those, fill in those missing gaps. Those are just two ideas I've had. I've had several others as well, but I wanted to bring it up tonight because we have an opportunity, while there's some downtime, if you will, for us to consider how to best implement this and to use those resources to take advantage of the downtime and actually get some of those gaps filled in and repaired. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Webb. And just to let you know, that is something that is on the radar of the ATC. We have talked about it in the past, and we appreciate hearing from the public that this is a concern out there, and maybe something that we need to bring back and have further discussion as to ways we can help to rebuild and fix those gaps in the sidewalk infrastructure. So thank you very much for that. Jane?
Bob,
Right.
and Webb,
Oh.
I am on the street repair review panel, and which is the Citizens Committee to make recommendations regarding the bond measure. And you should note that every year, a portion of the bond measure does go towards both bicycle and pedestrian facilities, including filling in gaps of sidewalk. The problem is that the need is great and the funding is small. So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. And I have some of my own creative ideas about helping bridge the gap in funding for sidewalk repair. So we could do that offline at some point, and I'm sure Lee could connect us.
Great. Next up, we have Sue Wolling. Sue, you can unmute yourself.
Unmute. Now
There
can
you
you
go.
hear?
Yep.
Okay. Hi. So I read a kind of lengthy article in the New York Times today that was it was talking about the massive changes in New York City's transportation that have happened with during the pandemic, and making a pretty plausible and inspiring, actually, picture of how it could happen to actually ban private automobiles in New York City and what it would look like and how it could work. And it was really very inspiring. And then earlier this week on NPR, I heard stories about how both London and Paris have massively changed their, their mode share for bicycling. Paris, I think their rate of cycling went up by about 100% even before the pandemic, largely due to a big transit strike. And then another 50% during the pandemic. And London has had similar big changes. And I'm just finding myself thinking, dang, why can't we do that? I mean, we've got talented, hardworking staff planning great projects, and why can't we get there? I mean, and I've heard it said, it's like, well, these all are big cities that have a really strong mayor that can just kind of declare it will happen, and it happens. And that's true. That's an advantage we don't have. But still, I mean, I can't help but thinking, if you just ask the average person, where is bicycling more likely to succeed? In New York City or Eugene, Oregon? It's like, we can do it here. And I just think we have to keep looking for, okay, we don't have the advantage of that strong mayor form of government, but what are the advantages we do have that we can make it happen? I mean, our TSP and Climate Action Plan call for, tripling the mode share for bicycling and walking. And frankly, I haven't met anyone who thinks that we're really likely to make that goal. So I just urge you to, let's find a way to be creative and make it happen here. I mean, if we can do what Parisians and Londoners and New York City people can do. We can do it here. So let's figure it out. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Sue. If anyone hasn't seen that New York Times article, it is actually pretty interesting and does some good graphics in it where it kind of flies you into the city and shows a change in the streets. I'll go ahead and forward it to Lee if he wants to send it out, if anybody's interested in actually seeing it.
Great.
Thank you.
And then next up, we have Duncan Rhodes. And just a reminder, if there's anyone else who has a public comment, raise your hand so we know that you would like to make that. Here's Duncan. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Duncan.
Hi there. Well, I'll tell you, I'm really pleased with this format of the meeting. This is the first one I've signed in on, but it's kind of hard to find out about the meeting itself. I would suggest that we make this a public meeting and have people contact Lee Shoemaker or somebody so that he can get their name, verify they're a Eugene resident, and make sure you don't get Zoom bombed. But wider public involvement, I think, would be a good idea. And I leave it up to you to how to figure it out. Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan. All right. Let's see. That looks like all the public comments that we have right now.
Okay, next on the agenda is approval of the June 11th meeting summary notes. Everyone in favor? Any changes? Everyone in favor? If I give a thumbs up. I wasn't there, so I'm not going to vote. Looks like everyone who voted yes. Any no's? Okay, so we'll move on. Fourth item on the agenda is the climate action plan. So Chelsea, if you're ready, we'll hand it over to you.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. All right. Do you see the PowerPoint okay? All right. Great. Thank you. I'm going to just jump into a presentation on the CAP 2.0. Most of the talking points I have for this evening are around changes that you can see from the first, compared to the first document that we released in November 2019. We re-released the document in earlier this week on Monday. And so I'll just focus on the changes and kind of the process that we went through to get there in this presentation. And I did receive a heads up on some questions that you all have from the staff, but I'll wait to hear those questions directly and answer those questions directly during Q&A. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. So we released that draft climate action plan, as I said, earlier this week, and we are working towards approval of that plan, hopefully at the end of July. And so this presentation, again, just really goes over the changes that we've seen between the two versions.
I just want to check really quick. Are others getting some sort of static or feedback in there? Yeah, we're just getting a little bit of stutter in your mic.
Okay.
Maybe.
Let me turn off headphones. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Sorry. So this slide really shows the project timeline. The project kicked off in 2016, or excuse me, the project really was motivated by the City Council updating the CRO in 2016. And then we reconvened the Mayor's CRO ad hoc work group in 2017. And that work group laid out the project plan for the CAP 2.0. And they had some important principles that they really encouraged us to follow, including really thinking about only including actions that we're committed to, focusing on the triple bottom line, and also building on existing efforts and adding momentum to existing plans. So that was really foundational to the project. And that group convened about 4 times in 2017. And then in 2018, the project formally kicked off. During 2018, we met with members of the Eugene Climate Collaborative. I'll talk a little bit more about that group later in the presentation, but the Eugene Climate Collaborative just quickly includes 12 organizations, including the City of Eugene, mostly public, who have really a systems level impact in terms of preparing for climate change from a resiliency perspective, but also have the ability to put in systems level changes around mitigation as well. We also did some outreach in 2018, and then in 2019, we convened the CAP 2.0 equity panel, and I'll talk more about that panel later in the presentation as well, but just a quick teaser, that includes 6 organizations from marginalized communities who came together to provide recommendations around climate work. In 2019, we also met many times with City Council to talk about different strategies that we could add to our list of commitments that are included in this updated version of the CAP 2.0. And then in late 2019, you see there the tree on top, we released the first draft of the plan. We heard a lot of feedback from community to slow down and take some more time to review and revise the plan at that point. So to that end, we reconvened the Mayor's CRO ad hoc work group in February and worked with them over the last few months to come to the document that was released on Monday. So as I'm sharing the document around with different community groups, I want to always stop and say thank you to all the groups that participated and provided input into the plan. We held 6 focus groups. We met with student groups. We convened that mayor's ad hoc work group. We convened the equity panel, met with the Eugene Climate Collaborative, and had 14 community events that talked about the plan. So thanks to all of you who participated in one way or another. We really appreciate you. As you're going through the document, it's divided up into 3 sections. It's a rather long document, quite a bit longer than the first version. We made it quite a bit longer and more detailed based on the feedback we were hearing from the community. But I think it's really important to know that there's these sections in there that help you kind of divide it up and navigate it. So there's a section 1 on really focuses in on the data in the plan. Section 2 focuses in on the actions in the plan. Again, our commitments to action, both for mitigation and resiliency. And then section 3 focuses in on how we built capacity in our community to address climate change throughout this process. You will notice as you go through some of these items are the bigger changes that you'll see throughout the document. So there's more detail in the document. It includes more actions and more detailed actions in the first version of the document. And it also contains a whole chapter on consumption-based emissions. It also includes additional topics compared to the first version, including a focus section on housing, on transportation, and on urban forestry. And it includes a chapter on actions that individuals can take. It includes more data than the first version, including a pathway to the CRO. It includes 72 ideas for potential actions that came in from community members. And then it also includes a community engagement strategy that includes a accountability and reporting component. It includes a timeline and then also a triple bottom line analysis of all the City of Eugene actions. And that analysis was reviewed by a subgroup of the Mayor CRO ad hoc work group. So with that, I'll jump into the different sections. Again, just going through the document, the first couple of chapters are the introduction and the process overview, which I effectively just went through, so I won't do that again. But as we move into chapter 3, the first, you'll see a summary of the local impacts of climate change. That chapter has a little bit more text, but it's basically the same as the first version and really highlights the different impacts we can expect in terms of less snowpack, more kind of instant water in our community when we have that rain. It will have hotter and drier summers in the dry season. And then also we anticipate having some increase in population due to climate refugees. And then if we dive into chapter 4, the pathway to the CRO, again, I'm focusing here on the changes that you see in the document. So the climate recovery thermometer is a big change that an important new graphic that you see in the document that City Council has been asking for a while. So I'll walk through that kind of slowly. This figure shows on the left-hand side, it shows the years from 2010 to 2050. So we include the years 2010 to 2017 to provide some historical data. And then out to 2050, you might ask, like, our CRO goes to the year 2100. So why only go to 2050 in our graphic? About 90% of the emissions reductions called for by the CRO are supposed to happen by 2050. So graphically, we felt this was a good happy medium to show this time horizon. And then our baseline year for the CRO is 2017 data. So that's why that year is highlighted and kind of is off that every 5-year marker structure. And then if we move to the right-hand side of the graphic, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions targets. Again, 2010 and 2015 are reporting the emissions levels from historical data. So 2017 is really the first year that I would point you to. And the goal is by the year 2050, our emissions should be 70,000 metric tons of carbon equivalent or less. So right now we're at 1,010,000 metric tons carbon equivalent. And you see the wedge getting narrower to represent that goal gets smaller and smaller over time. Next, in that chapter, we move on to this figure, which shows our emissions over time again from 2010 to 2017. And then you see in the orange dashed line, the Eugene's business as usual forecast. So that is showing if we did nothing and our population continued to grow at about 1% a year, and we didn't do anything drastically like to increase our emissions, but we kind of continue as we're doing now. Our business as usual forecast is shown there. And that would mean we'd get to 1,115,000 metric tons of carbon equivalent by the year 2030. And then if we look at that green line, the dashed green line below, that's the CRO goal. The CRO calls for an annual 7.6% emissions reduction. And so in 2030, that would mean our community emissions would be at 360,000 metric tons carbon equivalent. So putting that together, basically that calls for a 790,000 metric ton greenhouse gas emissions reduction annually. You'll see these buckets used throughout the document. They're a way that we've simplified really what we need to do to achieve our emissions reductions goals. And they divide up our emissions into transportation, energy and building, and fugitive emissions. So the transportation bucket, 53% of our emissions, that's really talking about emissions from gasoline and diesel fuel. The building energy bucket is mostly talking about electricity and natural gas emissions. And then finally, fugitive emissions is talking about emissions from our landfill and then emissions from refrigerant leakage. So these numbers are a little different than the first version, and that's because we transitioned from kind of mushing together the consumption-based accounting method and the sector-based accounting method. These are two really common ways to account for greenhouse gas emissions. And so in the first version, we kind of mushed them all together and then just talked about a sector-based goal. And so in this version, we separate the two accounting methods out. So that's why the numbers look a little different. I'm going to talk about the difference between those two accounting methods, but I'm going to talk about it in a slide a little bit later when we talk about consumption-based emissions. It's pretty complicated, and oftentimes folks find it confusing. So if that's where you're sitting right now, know that you're not alone. And I will talk about that more in just a minute. So then the last part of chapter 4 really talks about our pathway to the CRO. We came up with a series of graphs that I want to give a ton of credit to the mayor's CRO ad hoc work group members for helping me work through and come up with a good way to visualize this data. So our task here was really to show how, what actions we're going to do to actually get us to our goal. So first off, we start off by showing the business as usual forecast. And this graph aligns with that previous graph that had that dashed red line that was just slightly trending upward over time. So if you take it as a whole, it matches up with that. But then we divide it up by buckets. So this graphic shows you that our, again, our largest opportunity is in transportation and then building energy and fugitive emissions. We do make the assumption that if the proportion of emissions that a particular bucket represents in 2017 is the same proportion in 2030. That is not based on research. That particular research was beyond the scope of this project. So I just want to make that clear that that's one possible scenario, but we're not saying that that's what our modeling showed. We didn't have this modeling that was outside the scope of this project. So this is one potential pathway. This is really important to understand for the next graph I'll show. So here I show an example of how we split up the data by bucket, and this really shows our measured contributions in the CAP. And so these are figures 8 and 9 in the CAP document. You can see parallel figures for the transportation bucket and also for the fugitive emissions bucket, but here I just show the building energy bucket because it's a little bit easier to see, but we can talk about the other buckets as well. So here, I'll just walk through this graphic slowly. Again, the whole graphic, if you include all the gray, is just that business as usual forecast. Then the black solid line on top outlines the whole wedge for building energy emissions. And so again, that would be within this particular wedge, if we did business as usual, where we would see building energy emissions climb to over time. And then the top dash line represents the CAP 2.0 forecasted emissions reductions. And that's also outlined in the table below. So you can see for this bucket, we anticipate 75,000 metric ton reductions from the actions identified in the CAP 2.0. And then that bottom dash line represents the CRO goal if we proportionally applied it to each bucket. So to hit the CRO goal, we would need a 254,000 metric ton reduction or an additional 179,000 metric tons reduced. And then in the table below, I just want to point out that these are the actions that our technical consultant identified as the ones forecasted to have a significant impact for reduction. There are probably others there are many other actions in the CAP, in the building energy section even, that aren't represented here. And we acknowledge that we did the best, took the best information we had right now and said, these are the ones that are going to have scale and really reducing emissions. And we hope that we're wrong and that there are many more that have more significant impact than we expect. But this is the best information we had at this time to say, this is where we think our emissions reductions are going to come from in large part. So that's the example of emissions reductions by bucket. And then in this graphic, the pathway to the CRO, we put it all together. So we say for each of those different buckets, we'll have the emissions reductions. And then the gray wedge below is identified contributions beyond the measured contributions. So in the 3 buckets above, we include the high impact practices or the measured contributions, those things you find in the tables, and add them all together. But we still need another 305 metric tons to hit our goals. And at this time, the things that City Council is committed to are the Northwest Natural Franchise and Climate Agreement, which is work that the city is doing. Well, the Northwest Natural Franchise Agreement is up. It was up last year, and we renewed it for just 1 year so we could continue working on this agreement. It's currently in private, I shouldn't say private, confidential negotiations. And council is working through what that agreement will look like, and that should become public later I think in the early fall. We'll have to start moving through the public comment process. So if not before then definitely in the fall. State and federal action has always been an important component of the climate action plan. So we highlight that here. And then council has also identified they'll look to carbon offsets to fill any gaps using it as a bridge strategy until we can get more permanent reductions locally. So that's our pathway to the CRO. In the commitment to action section, we have 3 chapters. So there's the first chapter is looking at our local emissions reductions. And then in chapter 6, we talk about consumption-based emissions, and in chapter 7, resiliency actions. So within each of the different buckets I list here, we reference different plans and policies. This is a new component of the plan, but really harkens back to the original guiding principles of this planning process. So at the beginning of each of these sections, we highlight these plans to really help folks see that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel and come up with new actions through this plan where it's not warranted. We're trying to build off of things like the transportation system plan, the EV strategy, and so on, and really build momentum and energy and make sure we're getting resources to do those plans. They all include good stuff that help us get to our climate goals. So it's really important to focus there first. And then next, in these 3 chapters, we have 115 City of Eugene and Eugene Climate Collaborative actions combined. All of these actions are things that the city and the Eugene Climate Collaborative partners have committed to working on moving forward. We specifically through this planning process asked folks not to submit things that were aspirational. We only wanted the realistic, what people were going to do. I think this is really important. I haven't worked much with this group, but I think this is really important if you fall into the bucket of advocating for climate change and climate action. This really gives you that lens to say, okay, this is what the city's going to work on, and if it's not there, then you know it's not. There's no ambiguity. So I think that hopefully gives you some strong legs to know where you want to advocate and what you want to push for and ask for more around. And then in these chapters, we also include 25 state and federal actions. These highlight either things that the city is lobbying for at the state and federal level, or things that our state and federal partners are doing that impact climate change. Again, climate action at state and federal level is really important, and it's a way that we can play a leadership role really at a national level to push for action on this global issue. And then finally, there are 41 recommendations from our equity panel. So these recommendations, you'll notice the language doesn't say actions, the recommendations. They don't have the same level of resource commitment as the actions, but the city is really committed to, we've committed to reconvening the panel, and we're going to continue to bring those recommendations back to council and try and find ways to move us forward. But I do want to be clear that the resource commitment is different than the actions. Next, the chapter 6 is on consumption-based emissions. So I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about the difference between consumption-based emissions and sector-based emissions. This is like the details of my world through all of our planning and greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So my favorite example to use is a cell phone. So if you think about your cell phone, there are emissions that are emitted when the metal that's used in your phone is mined, and when it's manufactured, and when it's transported. And all of those emissions are emitted outside the geographic boundary of Eugene. So I'm going to refer to those as imported emissions. They're not local, they're imported. And then there's the emissions that are emitted within the geographic boundary of Eugene. So these are the classics like the diesel and gasoline fuel that we use within our boundaries. The electricity and natural gas that we use within the city limits, and the emissions from refrigerant leakage and waste within the city. So those are all local emissions. Nearly all cities, there's very, very few cities that look at anything except for local emissions in the United States. Eugene is always, as far as I can look back in our history of our program, we've always been talking about consumption emissions, but I do want to point out that it's a lot and it's a big stretch, and I think we should be proud of the work that we're doing to look at that and try and address it. Our goals around the CRO are focused on local emissions. And like I said, we're still trying to look at consumption emissions as well. So consumption is really putting together those imported emissions and local emissions. It's adding them both together. So again, the goals that we have throughout the rest of the document are just focused on local. And in this chapter, we expand that to look at imported plus local. And this graphic, figure 13 on the left-hand side of your screen, shows the intersection between the two. So on the biggest circle is consumption-based emissions. And then the smaller middle circle is looking at our local emissions or our sector-based emissions. And then in the middle is actually our fossil fuel use. We put this graphic in here, and we have a similar one at the beginning of the document that I didn't reference then, that in order to kind of show folks that our CRO includes 4 different climate action goals, 2 for our operations internally for the city and 2 for the community. The first one for the community is actually a 50% reduction of fossil fuel use by 2030 compared to 2010 usage. We don't really talk about that at all in this document, except in these graphics, to say that when we talk about emissions reduction, we are talking about reducing fossil fuels. They go hand in hand. There are some emissions, those fugitive emissions that are outside of fossil fuel use, but that's it. Everything else is relating to fossil fuel. So that's that graphic. And then figure 16 is one of my favorites. It really talks about emissions where some of the most impactful like products, food and beverage, vehicles and parts, in terms of emissions, it identifies what those different product categories are. And then it also shows where in the life cycle the emissions come from those products. So if you just take food, for example, nearly all of the emissions coming from food and beverage, that's coming upstream before it even gets to our community. But when we think about climate change, it doesn't really matter where the emissions are emitted. As a global community, we need to reduce them. So I think this kind of data is really important to recognize that we need to pay attention to more than just what's happening locally, and to think about the ways that we can impact through our choices, how we can reduce those global emissions. I think there's still a lot of responsibility that goes in other places as well, where these things are manufactured, but we certainly can support reduction of emissions in different ways. Kind of going back to the main body of the document, we also added 3 focus sections based on feedback that we heard. So we have these focus sections are on housing, on transportation, and on urban forestry. And there's quite a bit on transportation in the document. And Shane helped me out a lot in writing that piece. So thanks to you, Shane. And then finally, the last section is on building our community capacity to really affect climate change. So the CAP 2.0 process had quite a bit of community engagement that I talked about earlier. For brevity of presentation, because this is already kind of a long presentation, and I apologize for that, I didn't put individual slides in, but I'll go through these 3 chapters in a little bit of detail here. So the equity panel is highlighted in chapter 8. And as I mentioned, some of their recommendations are included in the previous chapters. And then they have 10 more recommendations included in chapter 8, all around community engagement. They're really great. I suggest you check them out. But to go back to the panel, we convened the equity panel as part of this project because we know that, marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so we wanted to get their voices in the room in a place where they could tell their stories and really impact our plan and guide our process moving forward. So like I said, we had 6 organizations on the panel. We actually had an application process. So 16 organizations applied and we had 6 seats. And these folks came together over 10 meetings and put together a bunch of recommendations. We actually have a case study on this work. I'd be happy to pass along to Shane if you're interested. But we're excited to say, and I'll mention again in a minute, we're going to get to reconvene this panel. We paid the organizations that sponsored the individuals on the panel. That was a really big deal to help folks overcome traditional barriers to engagement. Things like childcare, family obligations often get in the way, things like needing to work and not maybe having a traditional 9-to-5 schedule, or not even traditional, kind of that white collar 9-to-5 schedule, if you will. That sort of thing. So it was a really great experience. I felt like such a privilege to be involved, and I'm just so grateful to that group. In chapter 9, we talk about the Eugene Climate Collaborative. So as I mentioned before, that is a group of 12 organizations that we identified as having the ability to impact the systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our community or fossil fuel use, and then also prepare for the impacts of climate change. And it's pretty small here, but I'll just run through the organizations quickly, and you can ask me later. I'm happy to recite them off. But we have the City of Eugene and Lane County, Bethel School District, the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, 4J School District, Lane Community College, the University of Oregon, Lane Transit District, eWeb, Peace Health, the Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission, and Northwest Natural. And then the chapter 10 moves on to the Mayor's CRO Ad Hoc Work Group. As I mentioned earlier, that work group came together to develop the project plan in 2017 and then was reconvened in 2020 to help guide the revisions to the document. This reconvening of the group included about 22 members, I believe, including the mayor and Councilor Zelenka and Councilor Semple. It included representatives from the Chamber of Commerce and the business community, representatives from the Sustainability Commission, Budget Committee, and Human Rights Commission, a couple of equity panel representatives, 350 Eugene and Sunrise. Eugene also had seats. I'm sure I'm forgetting others. But we have a website. I'm happy to send the link for more information on that. And all the information from those meetings is included in the appendices of the CAP document. So yeah, I want to give a big shout out to all three of these groups who just had tremendous input on the document and were great community partners throughout the process. A part of the Mayor's CRO ad hoc work group product was these community ideas for potential action. So through that process, that group identified the need for more ideas for actions. And really they wanted new actions in the sense that they wanted new commitments to come out of that process. We weren't able to get there through that process, but we did collect more than 300 ideas from the community. The work group started to vet the ideas, but decided just because we had such a condensed project timeline, that wasn't something they could do to the degree that they wanted to within the process. So we included all the ideas, we condensed them down into 72 different ideas. And we'll be looking to this list as we move forward. We have a lot of things that we committed to that are going to take resource and time to get to, but when we're looking at our next round of ideas, this will be a place that we look. Excuse me. And on the screen, you can see just the different categories that those ideas were put into. So that's what's represented there. And all of those ideas are in chapter 10 of the document. Chapter 11 includes ideas for individuals taking action. So this includes things like calculating your carbon footprint, using modes of active transportation, consider telecommuting, using LED lights, making a meal plan to reduce that food waste, repairing and reusing items instead of just throwing them out, shopping secondhand, and creating a supply kit in case of emergency. And so the graphic you see on the screen shows that if we were just to think about this in a per capita individualistic way, how much emissions reduction would be needed by each bucket. And then the last chapter in the document talks about community engagement moving forward. We committed to 6 different items within this plan. So, oops, I'm sorry. So first, we're going to reconvene the equity panel, as I mentioned. And again, we intend to pay those participants, and we're really looking forward to hearing more and really sharing that leadership with marginalized communities moving forward. We continue to support the Sustainability Commission and then other citizen advisory committees, just like the Active Transportation Committee. You guys are really important to our climate work. And so we look forward to seeing what recommendations you all have. And then individual household and neighborhood action campaign. We'll be rolling out a communications campaign later this calendar year to really encourage individual action and hopefully get people interested in some different ideas. We'll continue to convene the Eugene Climate Collaborative. We're already doing that around electric vehicles. It doesn't look as formal as it did during the climate action planning process, but those organizations continue to work together. As you probably saw from the organizations on the list, that group includes a lot of public organizations that control a lot of the community resources that we get through taxes. So I think it's really important and to keep that group together so that we can leverage resources, collaborate and work together rather than trying to work through this on our own. And I think it's also been great in terms of getting some actors together that might not normally feel like they had the bandwidth to look at climate change. So in particular, I think of like our school districts, we all know are just, they're doing amazing work on really slim budgets. So engaging them in that conversation has been great. And we've been able to provide some different input that I don't think we normally would have been able to. 5th on the list, we're going to develop a sustainability business engagement strategy. The CAP 2.0 process didn't really have a good business engagement strategy built in. So this is really saying we need to do the work to go out and talk to businesses, including those businesses run by marginalized communities for sure. And then also talking to the chamber and Green Lane and seeing what what is it that's needed and wanted from the business community to support more sustainability efforts. And then sixth is reporting and accountability. So we've committed to 3 things around reporting and accountability. We'll have an annual report that really looks back a year that says, what have we done over the last year? And then we'll have, as a part of that annual report, we'll also be looking forward to forecast the areas that we're going to focus on in the year ahead. Second, we're developing a dashboard that'll include key metrics, probably about 10. We're working with the Sustainability Commission to develop those metrics. And then third, we'll continue to do updates to our greenhouse gas emissions inventories, both the city's operational inventory and then also the community inventory every 2 years. And that's in accordance with the guidelines in the Climate Recovery Ordinance. There's also a lot of information in the appendices that we added. So that triple bottom line analysis of City of Eugene actions is in there. Timelines of all the City of Eugene and ECC actions is in the appendices. And then, like I said, all the information from the Mayor's CRO ad hoc work group, including the ideas for the potential actions. All the survey results from that work are in the appendices. So what's next? If you have feedback, I would really recommend writing to your city councilor and or going to public forum on July 13th or July 27th and letting them know what you think. That'd be great. And then we also have a work session planned on July 15th to provide a little more time for council to discuss the document. And then on July 29th, we'll be going back to council, hopefully for approval. And just to finish up, I wanted to to go over a little bit of the work that we're already doing and have been doing for quite some time around climate and the CRO. We have work going on citywide, and this doesn't even start to scratch the surface of what our community partners are doing, just to look at the city. So in our Public Works Department, as you all know very well, we have the transportation system plan and the EV strategy, and I know staff are working hard on both those items, getting those implemented. In the Planning and Development Department, folks there are implementing Envision Eugene, and then we also have our waste prevention program, which does a ton of work around consumption as well as waste. Central Services, we're implementing the Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan. That's really a big part of our resiliency efforts. Our Intergovernmental Relations Program leads a lot of our work at the state and federal and does just an amazing job with that. And our facilities division is doing a lot of work on city facilities to make sure we're moving forward on those internal climate goals. Library, recreation, and cultural services help with fix-it fairs and things like bike safety classes. And then our fire and police departments, they're working on improvements to their fleets in particular, and also facilities improvements as they come up. So one of those pictures that you see in the bottom left, that's actually an electric fire truck that came and was demoed in our community. It was pretty fun to see it, and it was so quiet. It was amazing. And then last, the sustainability program. This is where we'll be focusing. In case you don't know, the sustainability program, we have 2 staff members, myself and one other person who's a limited duration staff member. And we will be focusing in on those community engagement components that I went over, implementing these additional actions that the City Council committed to looking into throughout 2019. So the Northwest Natural Franchise Agreement, we're working on that. We're working on what a home energy score, or commercial benchmarking programs could look like, energy efficiency programs. We participate in a lot of the work that Public Works does around the TSP and the work going on to align the TSP with the CRO goals. We help out with the electric vehicle strategy implementation. We'll be leading some work around reducing refrigerant loss, and so on. And then we also do work around our internal climate action plan, convening folks, supporting our fleet and facilities and fire folks in particular, and implementing their plans. And then we'll be purchasing offsets for our internal emissions this year. With that, I'll stop talking.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. Appreciate that presentation. In order for us to still take questions, I'll probably have people physically raise their hands on screen. I know that Daniel and Andrea have expressed some questions that they've sent back. So anyone who would like to ask a question, if you go ahead and raise your hand, I will call on you, and then you can physically unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Daniel, I see you as number one. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks for coming and talking to us, Chelsea. Really appreciate it. I guess my first question is I'm kind of wondering how CAP 2.0 fits into a global greenhouse gas reduction strategy. So like, obviously at the city level, there are only so many things that we can do. And so to the degree that like we're aiming for this many metric tons of greenhouse gas reduction, you know, from Eugenians, are we kind of where does that final number come from? Are we assuming concomitant changes at the state, national, and global levels? Are we assuming that we as Eugene are on our own and we have to do our part to take care of all Eugene people's greenhouse gas emissions in order to get to global targets? Tell me about that.
Yeah, good to see you. I know I didn't, people from different worlds.
Right, it's weird.
It is. Our kids went to preschool together. Anyhow, a great question. And I think if you're able to go back and watch the work session yesterday that we had with City Council, Councilor Pryor speaks to this a little bit. But I think we're taking the approach that we can't really count on other actors to reduce emissions through policy, although we're really hoping that it happens. So we're doing everything we can, knowing that we're in a resource constrained world, to reduce our emissions as much as we can at the local level. And we're still looking to state and federal government to take action. And we highlight that within the state and federal actions within the plan. That being said, I think that Councilor Pryor, what he said yesterday was really that as we do this work, it's extremely important to consider kind of as we weigh different choices, how we can be leaders in this work. Because ultimately, this isn't about whether Eugene hits its goals or not. This is about whether the world hits their goals or not. So if we can do things in a way that shows other communities how to do things. So let me be a little more specific. Eugene, if we look at different communities across the country, we have really low per capita emissions, really low. So it's really hard for us to get additional reductions. We're still trying, don't worry, we're still really trying. But it's gonna be really hard. Whereas other places maybe have they can get that low hanging fruit. It's still there, where we've gotten that years and years ago. So if there's ways we can do things like our natural gas franchise agreement that really shows communities like you can change the paradigm and you can do things differently, that's almost more important than us getting to zero super quickly. If we can get lower super quickly and show another community how to reduce their emissions drastically, like that's the win-win. And then the last thing I'd say on that is the Eugene Climate Collaborative includes the county and like Lane Transit District and so on. So I think moving forward in Eugene and across the world, really like thinking about things regionally is really important, again, because this is a global issue. So if other jurisdictions right next to us are still have really high emissions, but we get to zero, like that's not how this works, right? We don't like win something. We need to be partners in all this and work together.
Okay, anyone else has questions? Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was great to see sort of the accountability in the charts with business emissions, but I was kind of curious about how you're going to assess progress with like more of the community action stuff, like, and with the rollout of those plans of, people just, being able to compost better and all that kind of stuff. I was wondering sort of how you're going to assess that and how often.
Yeah, great question. So For my program, we really focus in on the big picture. So the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or where we'll be measuring things to track our progress as a city. But then for each of the actions within the climate action plan, we'll be looking at that through our annual report. We haven't designed that yet. And I do want to make sure we're using city resources wisely. So I don't want to just like comment on every single action just to comment on it. So we'll be thinking about how to do that in a way that really shows where we've made progress, where we maybe need to push as a community to do more, and so on. But that annual report will have qualitative information on progress in implementing the actions. But again, that measurement component comes in our inventories, which we update every 2 years. And then I think the dashboard will be a nice middle ground between there. We have 115 actions, and I don't think it would be a lot of money to do metrics for each of those 115 actions. So we're trying to, again, use resources wisely and hone in on 10 or so key metrics that will help us track that progress over time. And again, the Sustainability Commission will be working on that. So if you have thoughts, it'd be great if you could send them to the commission or come comment at the commission, because it'd be great to get your input.
Yeah, and just a follow up on that. I mean, I was looking at the timeline too, and it seemed like everything is like just start and go, you know. So I mean, I was wondering if there's going to be staging at all with like what things are going to be focused.
So the timeline, I mean, that is like the projected timeline that we're going to do things on. But I would say that like that's across many actors. So do you mean that it seems like we're doing everything at once, or can
yes,
yeah.
A little bit. Yeah, I mean, reading the plan, that's what it seems like.
Yeah, so the plan time horizon is 5 to 10 years. Excuse me, but I think you do see in that timeline that we are doing a lot of work right now. So know that that's because it's over many different actors, and that we tried to be honest as we possibly could. We are not being aspirational in anything in here because we wanted to be clear. So that is what we project doing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Alan, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself. You're still muted, Alan.
Thank you. So easy to do that. Apologize if you've already covered this, but my computer froze for a while, so I was out. But could you talk more about the transportation sector and what specific actions are going to be implemented to be able to reach the climate action goals?
I can. I'm going to be just pulling out the document because the nature of like putting this work together was very collaborative. So I would say like Shane, if you want to jump in on the TSP actions at all, feel free. But I would really refer you back to the document to get the details. So we have 8 actions around the transportation system plan. I'm trying to think of a good way to walk through them, to be honest. That's not just reading them to you because that's not helpful. We have a bunch of actions around a Vision Eugene and compact development. And then we have a focus on actions from the EV strategy. And those are really the focus of the City of Eugene actions. Shane, do you want to add anything there?
No, I mean, I think, you know, just for me, the main piece is just adding another sort of city support of the TSP and sort of highlighting the importance of following through with what is in the TSP. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I know this was part of the discussion at some point, Chelsea, was the prioritization piece of just like,
Shane, I don't know if it's just me, but you're kind of cutting in and out.
yeah, my mic's been doing that recently, so apologies. I think, is that a little better?
So far, so good.
I think some of it is on the TSP implementation piece, and that's, you know, that's a project that we're working on right now, is really what are the prioritization of those projects. Like we have this, you know, the 20-year and then beyond 20-year, we have the plans of what we're supposed to do, but it's more of like when we're supposed to be doing them and the prioritization piece. And what has the biggest impact. And so I think that this is, you know, sort of calling out the importance of that piece and just sort of adds more weight and leverage to the TSP as an important part of this plan. So, yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe we could, if we have some time, which we do have a little bit more time, we could pull up a couple of those specific items. So if you want to take a couple more questions, I can look at that too. Looks like Steve has a question.
Yeah, Steve, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Chelsea, I just want to compliment you first, you and the whole staff on what you've done since February from a reset to get to where you are now is just an immense amount of work. I mean, even if there wasn't a global pandemic going on, it's really pretty incredible. So my compliments to you on that. And I was looking at it specifically with regard to the recommendations that we sent you, and some of the things that we had recommended are probably non-starters in today's revenue world, but some of the things seem to be there very solidly, and I really appreciate that, especially the focus on transit-oriented development, housing and business, that sort of thing, which I think will be huge. One thing I just wanted to emphasize for you is on the recommendation on the action T4, which is about getting good baseline information on active transportation. I think that was in the transportation system plan to begin with. And one of the things that we looked at and recommended was when you're doing that, it's probably really important to consider to get information from people as to what are the barriers to active transportation. Because when you look at all the stuff Eugene has done for 40 years or more, we've been real big leaders on active transportation in terms of infrastructure, but it hasn't really changed much. And one of the things you find when you talk to people is when you do the surveys is people have a lot of different reasons that are highly localized to their neighborhoods as to why they do or don't use active transportation. So I think it's super important, considering the limited resources we have, to understand that the projects, as you prioritize, are going to be the ones that actually get the biggest bang. Especially when you look at your graph that shows construction is actually a huge contributor to CO2. So the last thing you want to do is add a lot of greenhouse gas doing projects that don't really return much active transportation. So that's my pitch. I don't know if the city is the best staffed to do research like that, but there are a lot of resources like, the university and others that are probably standing in line ready to help that kind of research.
Steve, thanks for those comments. I really appreciate it. Just something that comes to mind that aligns with that is if you look at the equity recommendations in the transportation section, so specifically E6, this was a really powerful recommendation for me. So it says create a public campaign on racism, homophobia, sexual violence, ableism in public transportation and bus stations to foster a better social climate for all and to use public transportation. This one's powerful for me because it gets at just what you're saying. We don't always understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes and whether or not they feel safe when accessing, whether it's walking, biking paths, or whether it's public transportation. So I learned a lot, like I said, from that panel, and that's something I carry with me now. And I'm trying to think of different ways to address even as a woman, I experience probably things differently than others who may feel like they are stronger physically than I am, for example, accessing our bike paths. So just making that connection between equity, public safety, and climate, it's all there, it's all connected. So how do we make that argument that when we support those programs, we're really supporting our climate goals?
Thank you. Is there anybody else who has any comments? Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of a question I've had for like a decade now, is like, so a lot of the actions, maybe there's a more specific version of them somewhere, but they don't seem all that measurable to me. Like they could be measured, but a lot of them are phrased in like, we're gonna, encourage or recommend or investigate or something. And it's like, so I think the one I highlighted was like, we're gonna encourage taxi companies to use EVs, right? So like, there's only some, some degree to which Eugene has control over those sorts of things. I know the Commerce Clause comes into these sorts of things in terms of, who can make what decisions. But given that many of the actions are worded in that way, like how do we go about estimating what greenhouse gas emissions reductions are going to result?
Great question. And so I'm looking at the action. It's T22. Is that right?
That one is T15.
T15. Okay.
Nope.
Okay.
You're probably right. It's probably T22.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
You're correct. Sorry.
No worries. So there's going to be some different answers for different actions, but here's my general explanation. The Climate Action Plan is pointing to a lot of other different plans where, say that maybe we're more familiar, this group may be more familiar with the Transportation System Plan, but perhaps the EV strategy as well. But within those plans, we're getting to the implementation. So for the TSP actions, my office isn't implementing, Public Works is implementing. And so that's where you're going to find a little more granularity. In other cases, the wording is really intentional to try and say that, I don't have the action off the top of my head, but in one case, we're looking at energy efficiency measures. The direction we have from City Council is to bring back proposals for that, but we don't have funding yet. So we tried to be intentional about the language, really to not overcommit in this document. Again, we wanted to stay away from the aspirational. I won't say we were perfect, but that is our intention. So if you see something where the language isn't as strong as you would like, I would take it as that. Like, we still need more advocacy and more work here. So continuing to push and advocate for more we need that.
Yeah, I guess it's not so much like I have a problem with it. It's more like, because sort of the sum of all of these actions is the targets, right? Meeting the goals. So how, I guess, how did this action or actions like this, how do those add up? What number do we use what number does this action get assigned?
Yeah.
Meeting this.
Gotcha. Sorry. If you go back to chapter 4, there are 3 different tables. And I can get the numbers if that's helpful. But anyhow, those are the tables where we really reference actions that we're scaling. And so you can get the exact number that we're estimating. Again, it's not all actions. And for example, the TSP is represented as 8 actions within the plan, and we roll that up into one line item to say that we expect to get us a lot, 240,000 metric tons.
Look at that, figure 7. Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
Okay, is there anyone else who has questions or hasn't? Go ahead, Grace.
I just have some questions around kind of barriers to implementation across all of the different plans. I know in transportation specifically, oftentimes projects take a long time to roll out, and the Climate Action Plan has very ambitious goals and timeframes. So I'm curious what you see as barriers for meeting those goals and what you see as opportunities to kind of push those barriers or break down those barriers.
Yeah, great question. I think often our barrier in any program is resources, meaning staff or people power, and then also just the money to say build, bicycle facilities or whatever it may be, right? So in this economic downturn, that's a serious issue, right? So this plan was created over the course of really 3 years, and we were on a pretty good economic trajectory as a community, and now here we are in just a few short months. So that's certainly an issue. I'll also take this opportunity to speak to the fact that we've gotten some feedback and questions about why we include actions in the plan that we're already doing. And just because of this very reason, it's because we know that climate actions are often vulnerable to budget cuts. So to continue to highlight the good work we're doing so we don't lose ground is often as crucial as putting new things in. So that's definitely one. 2, I would say less of a barrier, but just like a real opportunity as we have money coming in from the federal government through the CARES Acts. There's an opportunity here to rethink the way we do business in so many ways, right? So we've seen a huge shift towards telecommuting, work from home. But what are the other opportunities to help shift our thinking? I don't have all the answers by any means, but I think we can all see that something's happening right now. This is some time to be working in. So those are a few. I'm sure there are others.
Okay, well, we're kind of past our time for this agenda item. If nobody else has anything pressing they want to add, the one thing, Chelsea, that I wanted to just mention is the plan talks a lot about waste management and dealing with the emissions that come from that. But one thing that I've always wondered if could be changed in the city, and I know it's politically probably a difficult thing, but we have 3 waste management companies that go around the city and collect waste. And I always wondered if there was a way for us to alter that, to have our franchise agreement either with one company, which would be very difficult, or have the 3 companies separated by zones. Because for me, it seems very wasteful, no pun intended, to have multiple companies drive their waste management trucks that are heavy and do damage to our roads, and also create a lot of emissions and collecting waste. So just something to maybe put in the back of your mind, if there is a way to try to begin that discussion of how we might eliminate multiple trips by waste management vehicles in neighborhoods, either through altering franchise agreements to give them zones, or having all the companies bid for a single franchise agreement with the city to potentially reduce the emissions and the wear on our roads from all of these additional vehicles. So anyway, that's my only item.
I know that's on the minds of our waste prevention staff. I'm not exactly sure where that idea is, but I know we have staff that are thinking about that. And yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I think it's something we need to look into as well.
Great. Okay.
And because I'm next on the agenda and think we have the time, I will throw in this one question that we had from an attendee. And Duncan asks, is electric ceiling heat still legal in Eugene? It should be banned as very inefficient and wasteful. You know,
No, I'm not sure. Yeah. I know that building codes, which I imagine that would fall into, are set at the state level, and we don't have local control over that sort of thing typically, although I'm not an expert, so there may be some loopholes, but typically we can't control those things.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Chelsea. Really appreciate it. Done a lot of work, so great job.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chelsea.
Thank you all for all the work you do. I really appreciate you all. It takes a lot of time to be on these committees, and I just appreciate you for being here.
Great. Okay, so Shane, yes, you are next on the agenda, the bike share, scooter share update. Really interested in hearing this. I was very pleasantly surprised that all of my bounty hunter work actually paid off. I never in my life expected to ever see that balance. And then all of a sudden it showed up in my credit card bill. And I was like, whoa, okay.
Yes.
So
yes, Uber actually paid out the bounty hunters. So the bounty hunters have been paid. I think it's a pretty poetic piece to have our self-term bounty hunters being paid by Uber. That was great. And not only that, but we have had a generally pretty smooth transition to operations under the city of Eugene. You know, we took over operations officially on July 1st. There are still some small pieces that are being worked out. There's lots of little pieces from internet service for the site to leases and different parts and pieces that we are getting still from Uber and other vendors. But the most important pieces, the mobility cloud, back-end operation piece is switched over. Some people might be having to resubscribe because Uber paid everyone their balance and unsubscribe them. And so you will have to resubscribe with the new terms and conditions, which are pretty much the same terms and conditions, but just call out the city of Eugene instead of Uber. And we've hired on the 3 temporary staff. So we have 3 of the fleet techs that were with Uber are now temporary staff with us. And that's going really great. I've been doing a lot of communication and sort of back and forth, making sure that they have what they need. We don't have the van yet, so they have been doing all the rebalancing this past week by the trike. And then today they had the mechanical with the trike. And so we're trying to get those pieces all figured out. But they're a great team. And it's been great to have them making sure that the bikes are in order and, everything from fixing flats to replacing locks that are attempted cut throughs and all sorts of crazy sort of mini vandalism pieces. So a big shout out to those, that crew who's been really great in the transition. So yeah, I think that by the time we finish up this week, we'll have all the pieces finally in good order, maybe a little bit in the next week. And then Reed and I are already starting discussions with our purchasing department. It looks like we are going to do an RFP, but the RFP, won't necessarily be a, we put a call out for proposals and then whatever comes back is what we select from. It can be a little bit more of this is what we're looking for, submit your proposals, and then we can do a second round that sort of fine tunes based off of what we hear back. And so we want to put out a pretty broad one to hear who's out there and who's interested. And then, so in some ways it's almost like putting out a call for interest, a request for interest and sort of information, and then an RFI request for information, but doing it through an RFP process. So we're working out what that's going to look like and hope to start as soon as we can on finding out the process and of selecting our next provider. I imagine that we'll bring some ideas and pieces next month to ATC to get your feedback to make sure that we're catching all of the pieces that we want to capture for what that provider would look like. So yeah, and then we'll start this whole process transferring items over and figuring out which items we'll actually hold on to. We currently hold the domain now. We'll probably keep that. Certain pieces that we'll keep that just sort of make sense to have as, we own the bikes, and we own all of this equipment, and we're just contracting out the services part. And so I think that would be beneficial in a lot of ways. So that's where we're at right now. It's not a lot more information from where we were, but just to say that we are a lot more stable than we were last time we met. And so that's feels good, and that we're on the right trajectory. We do have a couple back-end pieces that we're trying to finalize, but it should be we'll have a really great solid system. And then my next big push, as well as finding this new vendor or this new provider, is that we want to get usage back up. I don't know if you've all noticed, but traffic is increased out on our streets and we're starting to see a lot more people driving. And so we want to start seeing bike share increase and people using active transportation again. And we know that a lot of people aren't comfortable with transit, and that we want to provide that service with bike share as much as we can and make it known that that's out there and accessible. So we'll certainly do as much as we can with our limited resources and sort of not having planned to run bike share. We're going to do our best to keep it not only going, but hopefully growing in this transition. So, and then on the scooter piece, we are still working on the RFP, finalizing what that's going to look like. We have not decided when we're going to release that or what it's going to look like, but I do know that Karen and Reed and Rob and some other city leadership are working through that process. I just realized that, yeah, it's next Monday is the council session. And so we'll know a little bit more about, you know, if that piece passes, then we'll be able to move the RFP process a little bit faster if we needed to, or if we wanted to. So that's the 20-mile-an-hour speed limits on neighborhood streets, but then it's also the scooter share and scooters allowed on the paths, e-scooters allowed on the paths piece. So we'll see where that goes at the city council meeting, and that will dictate a little bit of what happens with the RFP process. I noticed Josh has his hand up, so I will let you ask your question, Josh, and then if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand.
Yeah, so when you were cleaning out the shop or taking stuff over from Uber, did you find the kiosks, and is there any way that they could be put into service?
No, they never delivered the kiosks, and that was you know, part of the settlement process was going through that. Uber still did owe us $100,000 when we started the service. Well, Social Bicycles did, and then Uber took that on when they took on Social Bicycles because they were supposed to be kiosks. I believe it was 5 kiosks that were going to go out and allow people to sign up without having to have a smartphone or a computer. They could sign up at the station. So they were basically tablets that were connected. And as soon as we started the contract with Social Bicycles, they stopped that service, mostly because of just the prevalence of smartphones had become so ubiquitous that they decided that it wasn't worth it. And so they owed us that because that was in our contract. We started to draw a little bit of funds from that to use for like May is Bike Month and certain low-income memberships and different pieces. And they said, basically Uber said, once we did that, then it was a service cost and not a hard good cost. And so they were stopping service. And since they were canceling their service, they didn't have to deliver that piece. And so that was part of the settlement is they basically said, sue us. If you don't want to sign this agreement, we can just stop service now and you can sue us and to collect that money. We didn't think it was worth it to have to stop our bike share system over that. And so we just sort of ate that. We did get a good amount from them as far as all those other pieces that we've collected from them. And, you know, the 35 bike frames that we're getting from Hamilton that are Peace Health Rides bikes. They're the frames for Peace Health Rides bikes. That in itself certainly helps a little bit to take the sting off. But then also just all the tools and parts and sort of pieces that it takes to run bike share that we did not own before, but now we do. The trike for rebalancing and all of that. So that helps, but certainly doesn't make us whole. We are going to go after some CARES funding, which is some of the federal COVID relief funds that are available for transit. And we're hoping to work with LTD if we need to apply for some of those CARES funds because they haven't been tapped in Oregon very much, and that there is funding available for our state. And so we're trying to work with ODOT on that, and that might help as well, take some of the sting off.
We got about 4 minutes left on this.
All right, thanks. Steve?
Yeah, Shane, I'm just curious, from what I've been reading, it seems like this business model is pretty volatile, to say the least, right now amongst people who are operating bike share. And I'm just curious, as you're getting into this RFP process, what's the profile of vendors that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that the market is definitely shifting. There's fewer private vendors. Zagster got out of the market just about the same time that Uber did, and handed that over to Lime. A lot of there are still some vendors out there, but a lot of them are connected with a bike product like B-Cycle is a provider, but they're also connected with their own brand of bikes. And so they often provide their bikes and the service. There are, fewer models than there were before, but the model that we originally called out in our bike share feasibility study is more of what we're doing right now with sponsorship and bikes and looking for a provider. And in that feasibility study, we call out nonprofits. And so we are looking, leaning on in that direction, but are still open in that RFP process. But the nonprofit model is certainly one that we're leaning heavily towards right now, but want to keep our options open at this point. Pete?
What happens if we don't find somebody to take this?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a contingency for that yet. We are currently operating it. We have strong partnerships. We have the ability to operate it. We will continue to operate it if we need to for a little longer. I don't think it's good for the strength of the bike share in Eugene that we continue to operate it. I think that we'll be able to sustain it and grow it as much as we need for the time being. But I don't think that, I think that it would be better under another operator. And just not something that, there aren't any models out there. I think there's one, it might be LA Metro, where a municipality runs the bike share system. But that's in real heavy partnership with its partners, and we have great partners. So I think if anything, we would look more towards, like, if we were going to do it through the municipality, that it might be more through LCOG or an organization that's more regionally focused in case we want to expand it to Springfield. So. But we'll run it. Most of what I'm aiming for right now is through the end of the year. A lot of our lease and my mental picture right now is framed around finding someone in September, October, so that we can get them up and running and full bore. And by the end of the year, we'll see. I'm an optimist and sometimes set my goals as such, but that's where I'm at now. Alan?
I've got two questions for you. One is just, how is ridership in the last few months?
Yep.
And I'll say a second.
Yeah, ridership is definitely down. We were at 3 rides per bike per day for a good chunk, but without students here, they're a big portion of the ridership, and we're seeing a lot lower numbers. That being said, it is increasing. I haven't actually looked in the last couple of weeks of where we're at. Just kind of been down into other weeds. But from what I hear from the fleet techs, I bet Josh could tell us with his data knowledge. But from what I've seen heard from the fleet techs is they're definitely seeing more usage and are having to rebalance a little bit more. So we'll, I know that we were down to 90 rides instead of, I think at our peak we were at 900, but then we went back up and we were at, I think we got up to 300 at some point. So one ride per bike per day. But I think we're more in the 200 to 300 now. Does that sound about right, Josh? Were you looking at that data?
I'm looking at the dashboard now. So we've got about 100 rides today, which is with the number of bikes that are actually out because they did draw down the fleet. Some
Yeah.
is about 0.5 trips per bike per day.
Yeah, we're actually only at about 150, 160 bikes out. right
Okay,
now
so
of the
it's a little
300.
higher than that.
A little higher,
But we've all been social distancing, and so I don't feel like that's so much of a surprise.
Yeah.
That we've been told to stay home, and people have been doing that, which is responsible. So
my second question, which is actually a segue into the next agenda item, is there any discussion about placing the bike share bicycles in the neighborhoods where the open streets will be rolled out?
Yes, only in that I said, hey, we should put bike share bikes out on the open streets. And my team said, we should think about that. So we are talking about it. We want to get open streets done first, and we wanted to get this transition done. But it's definitely something that I would like to be able to look at that potential. There's definitely some logistics around making sure that we get the geo fencing set and that we have the right parking stations and sort of facilities available there. It's not ideal to have these sort of segmented away pieces, but there's certainly some potential, especially in the friendly one, because that is sort of part of it is already in the zone. And so we could just sort of stretch that out. I think some of the other ones would be a little bit more difficult, but it's something that we're talking about, and I'm interested in seeing that potential. Certainly, we have talked about doing some events around open streets so that we're not going to do a full Sunday streets, but if we have these open street events, we're hoping to go out and actually do some mobile, sort of socially distanced, playing music, slow roll kind of pieces to encourage people to come out and experience those streets if they're not out there already using them. And bringing the bike share bikes out could certainly be a part of that for people to use during that time. So that even if they're not out there all the time, they can be out there for, a part of it.
Great.
Hey, Shane, in this current COVID world that we're living in, what is the sanitation kind of
sanitization?
Yeah, whatever that word is, of the
Yeah.
bike program that we're doing?
Yeah, so the field techs are out there, and when they're rebalancing, they are sanitizing the bikes at the stations. So they're doing, a full touchpad, handlebars, basket, sort of touch points, sanitizing of the bikes. We have talked about, and this is something again that we're just trying to get this first piece done, about adding more at the station, so people can actually have hand sanitizer at the station. There are some of those sanitation centers that have been placed near them, near for downtown especially. But we've talked about even just putting up those little boxes of, squirt hand sanitizer right on some of the signs. It's something we're talking about, but we haven't made any major movement, but they are doing, the fleet team is doing that. There's some messaging that we're putting out about people being safe while they're out riding. I think Kelsey just did a post today on Facebook about, bringing your hand sanitizer or, and keeping a safe distance. I'm gonna just look it up really quick.
Okay, all right. Well, in looking at the agenda, I just realized that the bike share update went from 6:40 to 7 o'clock, and the Eugene Open Streets went from 6:40 to 7 o'clock. We're at 7:06, so we probably want to move on. And
I'm glad I squeezed in a little bit of the open streets piece. I will just say really quick, we have been waiting for an administrative order to be wrapped up and signed. We're much further on that point today than we were yesterday, and we're getting really close. And once that is done, we we have things planned, a traffic control plan and some other pieces. So we're closer than we've been, but we're not there yet. But definitely in the next week, we should be able to send out a little blurb of an update to everyone to tell you where and when. We are definitely already planning sort of the next phase in that we're launching in Bethel area first. And I'll just do this really quick. That we are, let's make sure you can see that and you don't see all my, you don't see any Zoom windows over my map there, do you? You all see the, oh, there we go, the map. So this is the area that we're looking at first in Bethel. And then we are talking with the friendly neighborhood and this northeast neighborhood at the same time. And so we're gonna be reaching out to those two neighborhoods, and then sort of whichever one we can get approved first, we'll put that one in next. And then the one after that will go in soon after. So we are sort of ahead of ourselves a little bit because we know that we're not gonna launch them all at once, but we wanna learn some things from implementing this first one in Bethel and then be able to implement any changes pretty quickly in these other neighborhoods. That's all that I have in that piece right now.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions about open streets? Okay, then I guess we'll go ahead and move on to project and program updates. I'm hoping there's some information on the West Bank bike path that I've been riding on multiple times and getting jarred to my bones. But anyway, we'll open it up to you.
Okay, so this is both Lee and I'm not sure if Lee has any more, but I do know that we heard from Reed, and the main piece that he wanted to mention, let's see here. Oh, and then he also said that ATC, I think there was a subcommittee meeting on infrastructure, could also talk if they had some pieces to share about what they had discussed at their meeting. I think that the most important one for us to talk about is South Willamette. If anyone's been on South Willamette the last couple of days, we have had some part of the construction pieces started. Just the initial piece, official construction starts on the 13th. So next week it's going to start getting a little crazy in that area of town. And we've been doing some messaging. We put up some variable message signs and done some media releases. And so we've had the first story in Register Guard, and sort of the word is starting to get out that construction is going to begin. We want to make it clear that businesses are going to be open, and we encourage people to go to those businesses, and whether they can walk, bike, bus, or drive there, that we encourage people to visit those businesses because they've already been hurt by COVID. And we don't want to add to that by having, with the construction. And so we are trying to keep access open as much as we can, but definitely recognize that there's going to be some interruptions and disruptions to that area because of construction. Construction will go all the way through to the end of this season and stop during the holiday season. So late in the fall, early winter, it's going to, it'll stop, and then it'll start up again in the spring and then be finished next summer. So it's going to be a long process. It's a very major project. Before there were some small disruptions with what happened, but this is going to be a complete repaving and major improvements to sidewalks and the water systems, and we're putting in new, blanked on the name, the Greenway, the green planters. And so some major pipes, and it's not just a repaving, but it's a whole reconstruction in a lot of ways that's going to improve it for people on bikes, walking, transit, and people driving through the corridor. So we really want to get that message out that there is going to be a disruption. It is going to be long, but to encourage people to be patient and support those businesses along that corridor. At the same time, there's a project on the Amazon running trail that's going to be starting, and that will involve some trucks on the Amazon Parkway. So Amazon Parkway is sort of another way to get to and from that region, and so both of those will be seeing some impacts. So we'll be encouraging people to not drive through those areas if they can help it, or to reduce the number of trips that they take in those areas, and to try and transition those trips to walking, biking, and taking transit as much as they can. Yeah, so those are the big major projects update wise. And then Lee, was there one other major project update that Reed wanted to share? Let's see. I know the Roosevelt project was complete, so that Roosevelt Path project. Oh, and then Bob, to your question, I don't have any update information on the West Bank Path. Do you, Lee? I know that we hadn't heard earlier today from the hearings official. So nothing's been heard back from the hearings official because we're waiting to move ahead on the paving piece until we know about the lighting piece. The project is lined up and ready to go, but because of the phasing, they want to see if the lighting is going to happen or not. And so if the hearings official gives us the green light, then those can move ahead. If there is an issue with the lighting and that has to go through another process, then from my understanding that we're going to work on just doing the repaving piece and then come back for the lighting piece, but I'm not sure if that's been decided or not.
Okay, I mean, the paving piece is obviously the key because it's getting worse. But yeah, no, thank you, Shane.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Shane on projects? Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know when the 13th Street project, when the projected completion date is for that.
I believe the original projected date was the end of September, but I think that they're ahead of schedule. And so we could see it mid September. I've heard some rumblings of even before that, but I'd say, the original was end of September, and if something happens, I think that that's what they're going to stick to, but it could be sooner than that. So.
Okay, Alan?
A couple of other updates that Reed passed on to us at the infrastructure meeting last week. First was related to the crossing across from the new Kids Sports facility on Amazon Parkway. He didn't have any information about when that crossing was going to be completed. He thought that the Kids Sport shouldn't be receiving an occupancy permit until that crossing is in place, but he didn't really know. And then the second thing he informed us about was the work that's going to happen on the Hilliard Extension and 8th Avenue intersection. There's going to be apparently some giant boring machine to get utilities underneath the railroad tracks. And so the detour that the River Path detour will also require a detour. So there's going to be a detour to the detour. And I'm not sure that Reed knows where that detour is going to go. Apparently there's about 5 different agencies dealing with detours and they're not talking to each other. Shane, I don't know if you have any more information about that, but it's not, it sounds like
It's
a
not
mess.
ideal. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have more information on that one. Unfortunately, we are, Reed and I were looking into that one. I do have a little bit more information on the kids sports one since Reed spoke with you. They were granted a temporary occupancy prior to the crossing being installed. And the temporary occupancy limits the number of people that can utilize the facility. And then it also expires after a year. They're checking in with the construction lead on the timeline of when the crossing is going to be installed. After we heard this discussion, I happened to be riding by there today and noticed that there were some cones out and some work that looked like it was being done right near that crossing. So I don't know if that sort of stirred something up, but hopefully we'll get an update soon about that crossing. Because yeah, I was really surprised when I saw bikes being parked at the bike rack there, and I was like, wait, they're starting to do things there. And then I heard a story on KLCC about how Kids Sports was open there, and then I was like, but you can't get there from the bike path, and it's a really tricky spot to get to. So I'm hoping that we can get that in there soon.
And one other piece about that, I had asked Reed about the reconstruction of the bridge across the Amazon Channel. And I didn't know that that is expected to be part of another capital project in, I think, 2024 to widen and lay back the banks of the Amazon Channel. So for, I guess, the next few years, there's just going to be that remaining
That
tiny
skinny
little crossing,
Mhm.
which is kind of substandard, but you know, it kind of makes sense to do that for the time being until a bigger project is underway.
Yeah, that's right. That project will go all the way from 24th to as far north as they can and sort of daylight and peel back those banks. And when that goes in, a new bridge will be installed, supposedly.
Alan, that utility drilling on Hilliard, is that related to your question a while back about trees being taken out there?
I don't know. I don't know what that whole project was about and why all those trees were moved, but it could have to do with utilities.
All right, so anybody else have any comments? We're kind of right on time at the moment. There's 10 minutes left in the meeting, so if nobody has any other comments, Shane, do you have anything?
No, I will say I do see one Q&A. Duncan asks, how about keeping the trucks from parking in the bike lane on Amazon? And I'm going to assume that that is in reference to the Amazon Parkway piece. And I will look into that and talk to Parks and see what the plan is there. I don't think it's necessarily, I don't know if this is an issue that he's witnessed or was just from my comment about construction that's going to be happening on an Amazon Parkway. It's not necessarily that trucks are going to be parking there. It's just that there's going to be trucks in and out of there and flaggers and work going on there. So yeah, that's all that I know about that one now, but I'll be happy to check in with Parks to see what the mitigation is for that project.
Okay, so last item on the agenda is information share. I'll just have anyone who has anything to provide information share to just raise your hand, and I'll go ahead and call on you in order. So anyone for information share? Well, let's see. I'll start with Josh.
So we don't have a ton of time to discuss it tonight, or no time to discuss it tonight, but I think we should put it on the agenda for a future night. One of the things that came out of our conversation in infrastructure subcommittee at our last meeting was the idea of another subcommittee, which is communications or advocacy, that the staff we talk to as a committee here are always really receptive and really interested in moving things forward. But that's not always true of people above them anywhere in the hierarchy. And so perhaps we need to be doing more work reaching out directly to the top, not as a committee necessarily, but as individuals. But we can still support each other in that. And so I do think we should have a conversation about how we can be better at that in the future. So.
Okay, thank you, Josh.
I will mention just really quick too, that this popped into my head, is that today we also, there was an MPC meeting and they approved the MPO funding for 2022 to 2024, those pieces that Reed had brought to you to talk about the different protected bikeway on Lincoln, as well as protected bikeway on, I'm blanking on the name now, on Oakway. And Smart Trips and some other projects. So full funding for those are moving on up. So that's exciting news and good, interesting projects that are going to happen in the future.
Hey, Josh, and I hear that maybe it's another subcommittee, but it also feels like to me that that's something that could fall potentially into the program subcommittee. I mean, at least communication and advocacy is something that they do talk about. And maybe if there's a specific line of communication or advocacy that they should be focusing on, definitely something that the entire committee could I think bring to focus. I don't know, Shane, if you have any opinion on that, but you know, it does definitely seems like it's something that falls into their purview.
Yeah, and I definitely, you know, need to get that committee back in order too. I have not planned a meeting for that subcommittee. So if someone if that subcommittee doesn't hear from me, please feel free to, you know, push me on that. And yeah.
Self-organize.
Yes, self-organize, and I'm here for, you know, helping as well.
So Josh, what I would say to you potentially on this particular item that you brought up is if you have specific ideas, concerns, direction that you would like a subcommittee to move towards, if you could send that to Shane and then he could bring it up to the program subcommittee, it's gonna be something that we could bring in. And obviously I would open this up to anyone in the entire committee. As far as communication advocacy, what we as a group should be trying to push out to the greater community as far as what they could be doing to move forward the active transportation idea and the goals that we have. You know, it's certainly something that I feel like the program subcommittee could use as far as any, you know, we've talked about creating videos or, you know, creating pamphlets that we could hand out at events once we can have events again. Any kind of that outreach to help the community understand what we do and what we would like to see happen, and maybe get some community involvement that would help kind of create an upswelling within the public to promote this stuff and kind of get voices outside of the active transportation committee going to council meetings and you know, really saying what we would like this community to do as far as you know, moving forward the ideas that we have. So hopefully what I've said makes sense. Steve, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm just, I heard two different things, Bob. From Josh, from you, I heard the need for an advocacy to the broader community that fits well within the purview of the program committee. And I think from Josh, I heard advocacy up the chain of command on projects that are stuck. Am I hearing that right? Because that sounds like two different conversations.
So I'm expressing some stuff that wasn't my idea. Julie Daniel brought this up and she's not here to better articulate her thoughts. And so Perhaps we could discuss it another time when we're not in InfoShare, because I think what Bob said makes sense, and I don't want to hog InfoShare. So.
Okay.
Thanks. I agree that what you said makes sense, Bob.
Thanks, Steve.
I'll
No,
just quickly,
go ahead, Alan.
I'll just quickly add that one of the things that Julie spoke about was, and Reed underscored, is communicating to City Council what the ATC has been discussing and our concerns on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I guess what I was maybe trying to incorporate from what Josh said is that, you know, that communication up the chain of command should be more than just the ATC, that we should be reaching out maybe to the community to get their passion and input into the things that we also feel are important. And how do we energize that so that they do move it up the chain of command, that they are engaging, you know, city staff and council and, you know, city leadership to help us, you know, broaden the voices that they're hearing about what we think is important. So I think we can have this discussion again at a later date, but thank you, Josh, for bringing that up. I think it was a very good point. Does anybody else have anything else to add at InfoShare? Okay, well, it's 2 minutes early, but if that's all we have, I could say we could. I heard something. I don't know what that was.
That was my kiddo.
Oh, okay. Does your kid have anything to add to our meeting today, Shane? Because
He made it to a great level on his game.
Okay. Well, with that, I will move to adjourn the meeting. And thank you, everyone, for your input today.
Thanks, Bob. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Right.